Good evening. You're watching The Digital Age, and I'm James Goodale. Is Google an evil empire? It takes other people's content. It doesn't pay for it. It's destroying old media as we know it. Here tonight to discuss that question is Ken Auletta. Thank you for coming by, Ken Auletta.
My pleasure.
He has written the best book on the digital age that I've had the pleasure of reading. It's called Googled, The End of the World as We Know It. Ken, let's start off. I want to go right into your book, pick a quote out of it, and the quote comes from Sheryl Sandberg. Sheryl Sandberg was chief of staff for Larry Summers under the Clinton administration, and she became employee number 262, I think. You've got them all in there numbered. And then became a vice president of global sales. And here's what Sheryl Sandberg says, and it's pretty much at more or less the beginning of your book. When Sheryl Sandberg joined Google in late 2001, she believed she had a public mission, a mission parallel to the one she felt as a ranking member of the Clinton administration. Yet to her shock, not long after the Google IPO, she first heard Google referred to as the evil empire. Why were people, particularly in the old media, I guess, referring to Google as the evil empire?
Well, what happened, the IPO was in 2004. And before that, no one knew what Google's revenues or profits were or the reach of its business. No one knew that it was starting to call itself a media company, not a search company. And what happened around the time of the IPO in 2004 was that other media companies realized, oh my God, Google may be coming at us. Advertising, Microsoft software, television, newspapers, magazines, telephone companies. And what happened with Sheryl Sandberg is that she was at a party and she heard someone talking about the evil empire. She thought they were talking about Microsoft, which was the old evil empire to people. And then she was shocked that, in fact, they were talking about Google. And some of that's a function of size and growth, but it's also a function of the fact that Google was bumping up against, which is the narrative spine of my book, traditional media companies.
Bumping up against the old media companies, and that's the narrative spine of your book? I thought this was a book about the digital age.
Well, it's both. I would argue it's both. Yeah. I would argue that it's a Google story.
I know you do.
It's a story about how they bump up and how they're really a surrogate for the internet, which is the digital age. The digital age changes the traditional media age.
Do you think there's also some lack of comfort with the position that Google takes with respect to itself? We are doing good. You say this better than I. We are providing free search. We're not really in it for the money. Is that a problem for Google in a way?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons they're considered one of the most trusted companies in the world, and people often overlook this, is because it's free. I mean, cable companies are not free. You know, telephone companies are not free. Microsoft's not free. All these other companies are not free. Google has a free service, and and consistent with that notion of free, you go to the homepage of Google. There are no ads on it. You press a search, and they chase you off the Google site. They're not trying to trap you on it. They send you to the site you want to go to for your search. So they've earned a lot of user trust. But there is a certain self-righteous quality to Google. Right. They love to define themselves as "don't be evil," which is their slogan, and yet they compromise, and they don't like to acknowledge that often. In China, for instance, when they start a search engine in China, and the Chinese government says, "Yeah, but we don't want anything about Tiananmen Square that shows tanks, you know, or what happened there really in the revolt," and Google ultimately decided to compromise. Was that evil, or was that just being a grown-up business compromise?
Well, why did Google do that? You know, was it early in their business career? Because they really, in a sense, you could say, didn't need the money.
They needed access, as every business wants to have access, to the largest consumer market in the world, China. And they were faced with the choice that other companies, Murdoch and others, have confronted. To get in that authoritarian regime's business, to serve and reach their consumers in China. do you play ball with the government? And if you don't play ball with the government in some way, goodbye. Take the highway out of here. You can't be here. So they wanted to be there, as Murdoch wanted to be there, as Yahoo and Microsoft wanted to be there, and all made compromises to stay there.
Why aren't they really, when all is said and done, just a money-making company, the same as any other company? In other words, they've got this idealistic framework in which they do things, but when push comes to shove, as it did indeed in China, don't they go for the buck?
No. I think that there are lots of examples. There's a mixed picture here, Jim. If you look at, for instance, I mentioned not ads on the home page. They could have, when they started, they could have gotten $3 million from Visa for an ad on the home page, that white page. They refused it. If you look at how they do advertising, the advertiser only pay if you click on one of those small text ads on the side.
We want to talk about that.
Okay, but they give 1% of their profits to charity, to their charity. I mean, Google.org. They have an IPO in which they have 2 classes of stock, just as the New York Times does, because they say, we don't want to play the Wall Street game of quarterly profits.
Guess who thought that up for the media companies?
And good for you. Good for you. But they're doing it too, and they're doing it for the same reason you did it. So that's, that's kind of noble, actually.
Well, let's look at the hot issue right now. It always was, but right now for Google, it's got this new service called Street Search?
Street View.
Street View. And I went on it yesterday for the fun of it, and I live way out in the middle of nowhere, and gee, I went through this country road, and there was my mailbox, and there was my whole driveway.
The number of your mailbox?
Yeah, the number of my mail, everything.
Not your name, though. You know it,
no.
but the public doesn't.
And the public doesn't know it. Now, of course, they can't drive in the driveway. That would be very bad. A question, do they have to do this? In other words, I'm trying to get at the point, where do they draw the line?
It's a very gray line, and it's one of the interesting questions about Google, and one of the reasons why people are alarmed about the data they collect. Every time you do a search, every time you go on Google News, there's a cookie that is basically a hat check, and they have a data about every search that Jim, you've made, what you've read, what ads you've clicked on, what you've purchased. And they don't know your name, but they know your zip code and a lot about you and your IPO address. So, and then with Street View, there's more information about you. And so people worry about what's going to happen with that information. I, for instance, when I happen to know where Steve Jobs lived, and I just wanted to see his house. I went on Street View. I saw his car. I saw the windows. I mean,
you done it for yourself?
And I did in the country. Yeah, I saw it. Same as you did.
I won't tell people where you live because they'll all be outside. Yeah. We don't need a free book.
But it's a worry because could not be abused. You bet it can be abused, and people worry about it. And when you ask, as I did, the Google 2 co-founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, about what they think is the most important privacy issue, as I do in my book, and what is their answer? Their answer is that the most important privacy issue is false things written about people on the internet. Hello?
Not true things. False things.
Yeah, false things, but
why
not
true things.
There's
no hello.
That's not the biggest
privacy.
thing.
Well, that's a tough question to answer because there's a First Amendment protection. In protecting the speech, you want to say truthful things about you, and so it's not easy. I don't like that answer they gave, but it's not an easy answer. Let's get into how they make their bucks and what they're doing to newspaper companies. Okay. Here's a chart that shows that newspaper revenues in 2006 were $46 billion. In 2008, they went down to $34 billion. That's a drop of 34%. Online advertising, of which I think Google has a 40% share, 2006 is $15 billion. 2008, $23 billion, up. And it's up the same percentage that the newspapers are down. So when people think about Google as a search company or as a media company, I wonder if the way to think about them is they're an advertising company. And it looks like they're taking a lion's share of the advertising away from newspapers. Other people are too. What's your view on that?
They are certainly in part an advertising company. They generate $22 billion a year in revenues, $4 billion in profit. Of the $22 billion in revenue, $21 billion comes from those little search ads on the side. And that's astronomical. That's equal to all the advertising in all the consumer magazines in the United States. It's equal to what is now 2/3 of all the newspaper advertising. Though it's not the money that Google gets online, well, that 21 billion is not all from newspapers. Some of it's from television and other things, and some of it's just from people who say we want to be digital advertisers, and this is a much more effective way to advertise, and it is, by the way. One of the inevitable things that happen here, and Google doesn't have to set out to disrupt and hurt newspapers or television, and they're not Microsoft. They don't have a lust to destroy their competitors. And actually, I would make this distinction. Microsoft was composed of cold businessmen. They were people who wanted to destroy Netscape and Apple and Oracle.
Really?
Google is, when they got in trouble with the government in 98, 99,
right.
Google is composed of cold engineers. And the difference here, Jamie, is that the engineer says, this is inefficient. Why can't we come up with a more efficient system? In coming up with a more efficient system to sell ads or Google News for newspaper, you know, inevitably they disrupt an existing business.
Does it bother you that we apparently are going from people who were liberal arts types who looked at the greater good as a publisher of a newspaper, head of a network, to cold-blooded engineers who don't have those skills?
Well, I think one of the things you see with Google is that their virtue, which is that they are cold engineers who can make things more efficient and do really cool things with that. I mean, if you think of the engineer who is creating applications like Street View or Google Earth or Google Phone or whatever, Google Voice, the people who are doing that are really the Martin Scorseses. They're the content creators in the digital world. And same at Apple. They're with the iPhone or the iPod.
You say they're really content creators.
They're content creators.
Because they're creating, I haven't thought about it that way. In other words, they're creating content out of content, so to speak.
Yeah. But
the new content is new, and it wouldn't exist if you didn't have the links.
It wouldn't exist if you didn't have the links.
So that's why Google's a content company.
But there's a second reason they're a content company. I would have a broader definition of content. Anything that keeps your attention. If you're on Facebook for 2 hours,
right, that's content too.
That's content. That means you're not for 2 hours on CBS or reading a book. So and that becomes a content. The flip side, or the vice of the same virtue of the engineer, is that they can only deal with things they can quantify. And how do you quantify fears or issues like privacy or copyright? You can't. It's judgment. And one of the reasons they're in trouble with governments, not just in the U.S. but around the world,
they can't think right.
They don't have a feel.
They don't have a feel for it. Well, these engineers created, the way I look at it, they created a couple of great things. They created AdWord, and AdSense at the very least. And I guess the third thing, I would look at Google, those two things plus the algorithm.
Right.
That's what it makes it.
Right.
But AdWord is an absolutely revolutionary invention.
That's a company picks a search word. If you're a sneaker company, if you're Adidas, let's say, you would pick a search word. You would say, anytime someone uses the search word sneakers or basketball or playground, or X number of search words, I bid the following amount for anyone to be placed high up in your search results by the ad, not the actual search results, but the ad results. And they bid against New Balance and the other sneaker manufacturers, all done online. And I only pay as the advertiser if someone clicks on my ad. And by the way, once they click on my ad, they can then click to purchase. And then I have information about them, and they're dealing directly with me. So it's a very efficient system. And out of AdWords or AdSense, which is a smaller program, which is basically marrying up the advertiser with websites who they would like to advertise.
In other words, you've got a website, and they've come to you, or they've come to me from my website, believe it or not, and say, let's put some ads on there. Okay, so then someone clicks on those ads. They only pay on a per-click basis, perhaps. Is that right? They
pay on a per-click basis, but you get about 55% of the ad dollars of that, and they get the rest.
But that's a big change.
It basically channels about $6 billion a year to websites, which is one of the reasons Google is such a popular company. But all in all, AdWords and AdSense equals $21 billion of revenue.
Yeah, and all that advertising coming from someplace else. And you coined this phrase, cost per. We used to talk about cost per thousand.
Yeah.
Now we talk about CPC.
Cost per click.
Cost per click.
and you understand why advertisers like that better for two reasons. One is they only pay if someone clicks on it, versus the old system, which is you're guessing who's watching it. You don't have to guess anymore. You know who's clicked.
Well, you had a nice little story about Mel Karmazin in there in the beginning of the book, which also appeared in the New Yorker, in which he said they'd taken the sizzle out of the business, but could Mel go around and sell things on the sizzle? He didn't have any proof, but it was just Mel selling. But Mel can't do that anymore, can he?
And so what
well,
Mel,
he can do a little bit, but not
and the point of that opening story of my book was to show that he goes out there early, one of the old media titans to go there, and he realizes as he visits there, this is before they did their 2004 IPO, my God, these people are going to alter my business. And he ends the meeting by saying, you guys are messing. He didn't use the word messing with the magic.
Yeah, messing with the magic. You did it literally, and it was something else in the book. Let's go to another phrase you got in there, like, which is called OPC, other people's content. And now, let me put up on the screen what you say from one of your people you interviewed. What that means is that Google has created an environment where the way to make money in the media world is with OPC, other people's content. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you do a search, if you go on search, and let's say you type in the words Obama's China visit, you get back thousands of results or hundreds of results, right, today. And you have like a 2 or 3 line headline of what it is, and then you have a link you press. Once you press that link, it'll take you to, say, the New York Times or the AP story about that. And then they can sell ads off of that. But they have scanned the stories in your newspaper or magazine on their own. And Google is getting a value for that. They're getting, you know, as a searcher, that's terrific. And you're not as aware as a searcher of what site you're going to get that information. And the worry is for the newspapers is that they're making me a commodity. But they are benefiting from the content you've created.
So I want to discuss this concept a little bit because it's really totally foreign to old media. Because old media, you created the content totally yourself. Now you say, interestingly enough, that Google effectively is creating content but putting stuff together, and I think it's an interesting point. But they can't do that unless they use content that's been created by someone else. And yet, you said at the beginning of the show, they're a media company.
Right.
Now, if you put aside this idea of synthesized material, just say all they do is go around and pick up other people's content, doesn't that strike you as strange?
That's not all they do, though. It's different. Strange okay, because it's different.
Okay.
I mean, for instance, if you do Google Earth, I mean, you could go to a place in the world, or you go to things where they alert you to outbreaks of viral diseases. I mean, those are wonderful services they're performing.
Right.
And Google Maps give you directions for how to travel to your country house, which people are going to do now.
And yours too.
Mine too. But if you go on Google News or you do a search for something, they are taking, you know, your content and benefiting from it in 2 ways. One is that they're selling some advertising off it. 2 is they're providing you search results, which you want. But there's a third thing, which is they're gathering data on you. They know what issues that interest you, and that's a valuable addition to the cookie they keep on you.
You were an old media writer for many years.
Still am.
And still am. Old media is in this book, but and you say it's the spine of your book. I'm leaping beyond in this question. Do you think it's fair for Google to do what it does? Let's assume for a moment that we see more bankruptcies of old media, which have been caused not just by Google. I mean, there are a lot of factors, the recession, so forth and so on. But Google has had a part in it. Now, if you had not, the old media company, had not spent all that money, they would have a tough time doing Earth searches and so forth and so on, because their main business is looking at old media stuff, I guess it's fair to say, or other websites. Here's the ethical question. Do you think it's fair?
I have a couple answers to that question. One, I would reject out of hand the notion that Google is responsible for the decline of old media. I think this is.
Okay.
I think what's happened to old media is much more the responsibility of old media than of Google or the internet.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean that Google and the internet don't have some responsibility for the decline of old media. But when I get tired of the whining from old media, and as I go and talk to these people and I looked at what happened, if you go back 10, 15 years, why didn't the music companies say what iTunes and Apple later said in the early 90s? Instead of having a model where we're only going to make CDs and you have to buy an entire CD, even if you don't want all the records in the CD, why don't you sell individual records as they used to sell, okay? And as in digital you can, and as iTunes does for 99 cents. Music companies had a crazy model. The newspaper companies, why didn't they invest in digital companies? Why did they invest in broadcast small stations, for instance, around the country? Why didn't they invest in digital companies? Why didn't they set up an online newspaper that was really a different newspaper than the existing one they had, and put it in charge of people who understood the internet was a multimedia, real-time adventure, not a newspaper you got to wait until you break a story till the morning. That was insane, okay? So I would argue that old media should have figured out the digital world earlier, leaned forward and been proactive, not lean back and say, oh, woe is me. Now, having said that, if you look at Google, clearly they are benefiting from the content of traditional media. They're benefiting from it on books, Google Books. They're benefiting from it on Google Search or Google News. They're benefiting from it on YouTube, which is their video counterpart, which is huge. But if you look at it, Google has already agreed to pay $125 million to book publishers and authors, right? So they've accepted the principle of compensation for content.
For that, in that deal.
In that deal, but also if you look at YouTube, they're beginning to pay for some, because they realize in YouTube they need professional content, that advertisers will not advertise on user-generated content, which is unfriendly and unpredictable. So Google is starting to pay, and their losses, which they're still losing money on YouTube, are going down because of that. And so it is not inconsistent, and they don't pay directly, but every time they send you to the New York Times site or the Washington Post site, you can sell ads off it. And the Times, about 12 or 13% of the New York Times' revenue comes from digital world. Some of it from Google News and Google Search. But then newspapers can come and say, wait a second, if what you want in search is authoritative results, you need the New York Times, you need the Wall Street Journal, you need the Washington Post. Pay us for it. And I think that's the next battle we're going to see.
Let me ask you, I was just about to ask you, do you think that Google will start doing that? And let me ask it in the context of what Rupert Murdoch said recently. Rupert doesn't go on the net, we all know, and he's just waking up to what's going on. And he said, well, he said, what I said to you, I don't think it's fair. It's not fair use. That's a magic word which permits Google to do what it does. It's a copyright word, which means you don't have to pay. So, you think Google will take the big step of paying for some of the content that they use?
I think it's going to be very tough for them, because you got a long line of people with their hat in hand wanting a payment from Google. That make my business whole again. Yeah. It's impossible to do that. Yeah. And now I could see them wanting to make a deal, or potentially making a deal with the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post, established serious newspapers. Are they going to make the same deal with some of Murdoch's other properties, like the New York Post? No way. Are they going to make the same deal with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch? No way. So I think one of the questions is, but then the interesting problem for the Murdochs and those who would be paid if they could work out a deal with Google is, if some newspapers create a paywall, as Murdoch is threatening to do, and others.
That means you have to pay before you see the Wall Street Journal.
Before you see it, and we're not going to allow you to search the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times.
Well, that's another thing Murdoch said. He said, I'm not going to let any Google search any of my websites. Yeah.
But then the question becomes, if every newspaper doesn't go along, and every newspaper won't go along, including the wire services, then people on Google search can still get information, and what happens to?
They'll just go someplace else. They'll probably just go someplace else.
And therefore the Journal and the Times and those behind the paywall are depriving themselves of revenue from search and of exposing themselves to more eyeballs.
Now you were inside the paywall of Google, so to speak, and you described these engineers who come off as very nice people, but missing something. We're all missing something, and we talked about what they're missing. Do you think that there's a mindset in there that would open up their minds to considering making such a payment? In other words, is a person who would do it? We have these two inventors we haven't talked about who are very young engineers, and then we have an older engineer, a gentleman named Schmidt. Will they do it? You have to be quick because we've got to finish. Yes or no?
I think they might.
Okay, now here we come to the end. Google doesn't pay for people's content. You say they might, but they don't now. They're very large. Is Google an evil empire?
No, they're not an evil empire. But do they do things that some people consider evil? Sure, but that doesn't make them evil. If you're a traditional media company and your business is being decimated by the digital world, and in part by Google, you don't look kindly upon them. But that doesn't make them evil because you call them evil.
I'll call you Ken Auletta, and you are Ken Auletta. Thank you for coming by. And thank you for coming by, and come by next week and learn more about the digital age. I'm James Goodale. Good night and have a good week.